21st Century Entrepreneurship with Martin Piskarik.
I think the interesting thing about my career has been that for the first 30 years of my career, I worked for large international companies. I worked for L'Oreal, Diageo, PepsiCo, and Vodafone Group. And I absolutely loved that 30 years. But the question I asked myself almost every day of 30 years is, am I not entrepreneurial? Am I not an entrepreneurial guy? Because I met so many inspiring entrepreneurs who'd done amazing stuff. But I had my paycheck every single month for 30 years, and people took risks that I didn't take. And then suddenly, 7 years ago, I was offered the opportunity to become the CEO of a much smaller company that had been founded by two very impressive entrepreneurs who'd got to the point where they knew that it was no longer the time for them to run the company going forward. So the question I was now asking myself was, could I be successful in a more entrepreneurial environment? And what I decided was that I needed to stay very true to what I'd learned over those 30 years and apply them in a more entrepreneurial spirit. So the four things that I held dear at that time were, number one, I passionately believe that to engage and work with customers effectively, you have to be responsive. It doesn't matter if it's good news, bad news, whatever it is, but being responsive to a customer's needs, I have found to be effective both in large corporate and an entrepreneurial environment. The second thing that I really passionately believe in is that if you want to be successful about bringing a company together, you have to have an authentic purpose. And we'd done big charity stuff in 30 years, like big charity stuff. But in my case, I had the opportunity to build authenticity with my education program in Kenya and my refugee program in East Africa. But it wasn't just about helping them, it was helping my company to understand that our purpose wasn't just to make money for shareholders, it was to help people's lives every single day. The third thing I took with me was, largely successful companies do have good corporate governance and structure and understand how their company operates. And what I'd learned in 30 years was that the tighter you kept the leadership team and the most engaged you could keep the leadership team was the way for the rest of the company to buy into what you were doing. Of course, I do believe the CEO has a strong responsibility to talk to everyone, but actually that leadership group have to be really clear that they're buying into your vision and they take that to the rest of the organization, I think is incredibly important. And then I think my final learning was, you got to remember you've got shareholders, you've got to remember you've got investors, you've always got to keep an eye on the people that have helped you to get to where you are today. This started when I was in Vodafone in Ghana around 2010, and I was approached by the Scottish Government. Obviously my background is Scottish, and it was a time when the First Minister of Scotland was Alex Salmond, and Alex Salmond had a real desire for Scottish expats to support local Scottish companies in their ambition to grow internationally. And so I thought this was a fantastic initiative and I signed up for this, and so we were called Global Scots. So Scots who are working globally, who are helping small companies. So what the process was that they introduced me to 10 different startups, very small companies in some cases, and they were trying to keep them in my zone, which was I was a telco guy. So 10 software, telecoms sort of world. And I narrowed it down to one company eventually, which was a company called Seacal, based in Edinburgh. And they had a very clever product. And what the product did I really liked was, in essence, they'd created a product where the way that telecoms networks are measured is on a KPI basis of availability. So you'll have heard of 99.999, which is the five nines, which denotes almost perfect availability. And so that's how people measured a mobile network, was for this technology function to say, hey, we're 99.999. And what caught my attention was, of course, that that's never a personal experience for you. So you have your own personal experience of, actually, when I drive to work every morning, I get really bad reception in one area and the call drops. Or in my house in the country, it's terrible. So our own experience is defined by what we don't care that the telecom company has a 99.99 average, because we're living our own reality. So the CCAL idea was that they were going to be software in the network that could measure specific individual experiences and also to translate that into specific applications. So for example, they could measure what was your experience with WhatsApp or what was your experience with Facebook. So when I met the founder, oh God, he was so charismatic, absolutely charismatic. Loved him. He would tell a great story. I was nodding. I'm the CEO of Vodafone in Ghana, and I'm thinking, wow, this is a really cool product. This is exactly what we could do to differentiate our network. So I invited him to come to Ghana and meet my team. And what I wanted for him was, I wanted him to have the opportunity to present to every single person that would be important when it came to selling his product into a large telco. So I had the CEO, the COO, the CTO, the CFO, the head of marketing, everybody was there. And Frank gets up and starts his presentation off, and he said, the number one issue you have is that you don't understand how to measure your network properly. And I thought, that's a brave opening. So I thought, I'm not going to derail his opening quickly, because at that point I'm thinking, no, here's like my 10 issues that I'm really worried about, and honestly, that's not there. But I love your product, but it's not going to be my top 10 issues. So he started this presentation, he started talking about how he'd presented to 60 telecom companies around the world. They didn't understand that they were getting it wrong because they hadn't bought his product. And if they'd only bought his product, he would have been able to help their network performance and they would be in much better shape. I think, oh my goodness, I'm looking around the room and right, of course, people are thinking, what's this guy talking about? Genuinely, what is this guy talking about? So at the end of the meeting, I said, okay, Frank, thanks so much for the presentation. I said, let me go one by one round the room and find out if there's any questions from anybody. There was a couple of minor questions. And then I said, so who in my team wants to take this project forward? Now you had the CEO, me, and the most junior marketing person in the room, who was like 4 layers away from me, Marcus, said, I'll take it. And I thought, okay, that's interesting. Marcus wants to take it. So I say, Marcus, what's your interest? He said, hey, I think we can bundle this into a product. I think we can make something happen with this. I would be interested in taking forward. No problem. So Frank says, thank you. I'll drop you an email, Marcus. And off he goes back to Scotland and we go back to our day jobs. About 4 weeks later, Frank calls me and says, nothing's happening. Nothing's happened in the last 4 weeks. I'm really frustrated. I thought you guys were interested. So of course, I go to Marcus's boss and say, can I see Marcus? And Marcus has been on holiday for 2 weeks. Okay. So eventually Marcus comes back and I say to Marcus, what's the scoop? He said, oh, Kyle, I'm really sorry. I've been on holiday. I've got this pile of work to do and I'll get to it. I promise you I'll get to it. Fine. 4 weeks later, Frank comes back to me again and says something's still not happened. So I get Marcus in and I say, right, what's going on with CCAL, Marcus? And he says, well, look, Cal, the problem is I took it to technology and technology said, what do you want us to stop so we can do this? Because we've got this list of projects. And I think, oh, So you phone the chief technology officer who says, Cal, sorry, let me look into it. Another week goes by, another week goes by. And I say to Rami one day, what's going on with CCAL? He went, oh yeah, look, what happened was that we took it to the CapEx committee. So the CapEx committee being the one that looks at spending capital expenditure across the company. I took it there and they looked at it and they said, well, hang on a minute, it's a 27-month payback. And Kyle's rule is that we're not going to implement anything that's beyond 24 months payback. He said, Kyle, it's your rule. Martin, we're 3 months in now from the original meeting. So I said to Frank, I said, look, Frank, this is a disaster for me, right? Because this is how big companies work. And you've got the CEO sponsoring this, but a guy went on holiday. Technology said it wasn't a priority. And then my CapEx meeting implemented my rule and said we shouldn't do this project. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to ram it through. I'm just going to ram it through. I'm going back to the CapEx committee myself. So I go back to the CapEx committee and say, put this one through. So it gets put through. We start a POC, so the proof of concept. Oh my goodness, 3 months that took, right? Because I've lost interest now, because I've done my bit. I've got him a POC, it's now down to the product. 90 days later, he said to me, what's going on? So I go back to Marcus and team, and they go, it's really good, but Vodafone Group have their own product that they think can do what we're doing. So Vodafone Group have told us that they would rather implement their product than our product. Okay, so I say, right, I want everybody in one room, and I get everybody in one room and say, I don't care what you have to do, but I want this product in our network and a contract agreed with CCAL now. Took me 8 months. It took me 8 months to get him a contract. And of course, the point was that the moral of the story was that Frank just didn't understand that when you've got a product that you love, it doesn't mean that your customers are going to love it the same way that you love it. So my lesson I learned from him was, you stand up and say, you really need this. It doesn't necessarily translate into that is actually the belief the company take. And then when you're going to deal selling to large other companies, you get big contracts, but you absolutely have to have someone in that company who's going to sponsor your product or service through the process that we naturally go through. And it was fantastic. I think we signed like a $800,000 deal eventually for Frank, and it was a huge success, the product. But the moral of the story was, without the sponsor internally, I don't think he would have landed that. He would not have landed that project. That would have been the kind of real moral of that story. And when I tell that story to entrepreneurs, I see this look on their face of acceptance and understanding. That's exactly what happens to them when they deal with big companies. And my argument is, look, big companies like dealing with big companies because they have enough people to waste time with each other. The danger of a big company and a small company is that they will waste your time in the same way, but it's you and your company on its own. So let's go to the second one, which is my own company, Avanti. So the story here is very interesting for me because I'd historically been a big company guy. I'd always admired entrepreneurs who took the brave decision to create their own opportunity and work hard to deliver it. So what happened was 22, 23 years ago, the two founders were very different from each other. So one was a ex-finance guy in the city in London, so he knew how to raise money. That was his real skill set, was raising money. The other guy was a proper satellite expert, so he knew satellites, he knew how to build satellites and launch satellites. So they both independently had a similar idea, which was that if you think about satellites being different types of, let's say, mobile network, largely the satellite industry for 50 years was built on KU band and C band, which was wide coverage but very, very narrow band, so that it was not high throughput. So it was like 2G. Their idea was that in the developing countries like India and Africa, that people would want to go straight into high throughput broadband. They would want access to the internet. And I completely agree with that industrial logic. So that was Ka band, which was a new band. So they both independently were going to the European Space Agency and asking to borrow some money from the European Space Agency because they wanted to get a satellite done. Now, when you have a funding commitment from the Space Agency, you can go to other people to raise the rest of the money. And typically a satellite can cost $300-400 million. So it's an expensive item. So they both get rejected by the European Space Agency. So they meet each other and decide to collaborate with each other. And eventually they do convince the European Space Agency to give them 40 million euros. So here's what I love about entrepreneurs is that David, the finance guy, founder, he took his 40 million euros and over a period of 8 years turned it into $1.2 billion, convincing people of this story, which is we will dominate internet in Africa. And the numbers are true. 600 million people not connected in rural communities. You will never see fiber, microwave, or mobile networks. It has to be satellite. It does have to be satellite. And the other David Bestwick, the engineer, said, great, let me go build some satellites now. So between roughly 2010 and 2018, they managed to launch the 4 satellites with the $1.2 billion. So I love that part of the story because that part of the story is everything about being a great entrepreneur, being brave, taking risks, convincing people to support your idea. And I mean, we're talking about where they managed to convince public shareholders by listing on the AIM market in the UK. They convinced BlackRock. I mean, they convinced really compelling companies to put the money into this company. What happened then was that, as I like to cheekily say, they forgot 2 golden rules of being an entrepreneur. The first one was someone has to buy your product. And the second one is you have to be able to pay your investors back. So, of course, these guys were so busy building and spending that they forgot, wow, somebody's going to start asking for a dividend or they're going to start asking for their debt to be repaid. So that means we have to start monetizing it. So I think that golden rule was that it's great getting the money, it's great getting the product, but always remember, sell it and return investment to those investors, or they'll get pretty angry with you. And that's exactly what happened. So by 2017, the investors, who now had nearly $1 billion of debt in the company, were frustrated by the lack of sales and frustrated by the lack of understanding about how they were going to get a return on their investment. So when I turned up in 2018, my mindset was, look, I've got a great network. These guys done an amazing job, but I've got to go and sell my capacity as fast as I possibly can, because my business mind was saying to me, don't worry about anything else in that company apart from monetization of the assets. So by being a corporate guy, I knew I have to go and talk to big companies, because they had 116 customers, but they were small. So we looked at the customer base and said, hang on a minute, we've got a very high share of these 116 customers' revenue, 80%, but they don't spend much. So my idea was, let me go talk to the biggest players in the industry and see if there's an opportunity for us to seriously increase the ticket sale size. And that's what we did. Between April and September of 2018, we signed a $124 million 7-year deal with my biggest customer now, Viasat in California, because we were able to show them the value of the network and what the network could do for them. And that was the underpinning growth of the company, was the confidence that people now felt about monetization. And I think that's what I said, was that I inherited a company that was absolutely brilliant at spending money and managing a network, but really didn't understand the golden rule of return money to shareholders, generate revenue, be customer intimate. And from a cultural point of view, I remember sitting with an investor who was very unhappy. This was in Mayfair. He was very unhappy. He'd put money in, and he told me a story of how the previous founder CEO, I mean, they were never going to make any money from this. And he sat down with the founder and he said to him, "I'm really unhappy. The first thing you need to do is you need to step back and bring a professional CEO in who knows how to run the company properly. And the second thing you need to do is stop spending so much money and start thinking about us." And the founder said no and no and got up and left. And the guy laughed, fortunately, and he said to me, "What are you going to do?" I said, "Well, I know how to run companies." And I understand exactly what you need, so please trust me to run the company in a way that's going to be good for you. When I think about the significant lesson I learned from both of those stories, one around a founder not really understanding how to sell properly, and secondly, two founders who didn't know how to run or monetize a company, my insight was that there comes a moment in every company's growth where the founder has to accept that they probably had a passion for their product, but hadn't ever had the opportunity to work across sales, marketing, finance, HR. And that passion for their product should stay within the company, but they needed to yield the leadership of the company to someone who had experience of connecting with customers, connecting with people, building business plans, and running it on a professional basis. And that was my objective with Avanti, was that I'd spent 17 years in Vodafone being groomed to be a CEO, and I'd spent obviously 10 of my 17 years as CEO, that I came in and tried to run the company like it was a Vodafone company from a governance and structure point of view, but not to lose the fact that we were entrepreneurial and that we were going to continue to work with our entrepreneurial spirit, which meant that even today, 7 years into this job, we get back to customers within 4 to 6 hours. When a customer asks us a question, and I'm not talking about customer service, I'm talking about they want a product or they want a deal, quite complex deals, we will go back faster than anyone else in the industry. And I learned that lesson from my job in South Africa with Liquid Telecom, where I had a 1,500 person company, about $500 million of turnover, and one of our biggest customers was Vodacom. And so my salesperson went to see Vodacom and was given an opportunity to bid for a contract, and came back and then went through a big company process. At the same time, a small, nimble company called Secom in South Africa, the sales guy came back and sat down with the CEO and the CFO 5 minutes after he arrived back in the office. And within an hour, they'd agreed the deal. And within an hour and a half, he'd gone back to Vodacom with his commercial offer. My salesperson had a 5-day SLA from marketing, a 5-day SLA from product, and a 5-day SLA from the pricing team. And they didn't serve concurrently. They were cumulative. So it meant he had 15 working days to wait. And no. I said, I want to be like Secom. So when I came to Avanti, I said, I want to be all the values of a big company, but I want to be like Secom. I want the sales force to have access to the right people quickly. Because guess what Vodacom did? They gave the deal to Secom. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you give the deal to Secom? Same type of product, same solution, but they've responded in 24 hours and we were going to wait 15 days. And I think that's the golden rule here is, can you translate the spirit of entrepreneurship into your company, but create a good governance and good corporate structure environment so people do know how to build integrity into the organization? The interesting part for me is that I had two professional experiences. The first half of my career was L'Oreal, Diageo, and PepsiCo. So amazing international companies. I loved the brands. I learned how to manage customers. I then began to bolt on to, let's call it marketing and commercial. But I was working within a very structured environment. So what I was learning was that if you wanted to win with customers, whether it was a ladies' hairdressing salon or it was at PepsiCo with large UK retailers, there was one common purpose that was effective with all of them, which was to be responsive. So you personally had to be responsive because you knew your company wasn't responsive at the same pace as you were. So what I learned to do was that my responsiveness became about my relationship with that person I was dealing with. So let's take that as bucket number one, which says in a customer environment, building a relationship around responsiveness, even if you're saying no, it's okay. You were responsive, right? You were responsive. As I joined the telecoms industry and I realized that actually the telecoms industry when I joined 25 years ago was obsessed by network. So when I joined Vodafone in 2000, the first day I was on understanding mobile networks course. And I think, okay, that's really interesting. But we've got thousands of engineers who really know how the network works. I want to understand how we sell more to customers. So I'm going to not worry about that too much and I'm going to focus my attention on the customer agenda. The third lesson I learned was that it wasn't me who created this story, but in the UK business we had 10,000 people. And one of the CEOs coined a phrase which was, how do we break through the concrete layer? And the CEO was telling you that if you're CEO with 10 direct reports, they have 10, you can probably talk and engage with 110 people. Well, what about the other 9,900? Well, they're managed by the concrete layer, who tend to be people who've been in the company for a while, they're middle management, and they don't like change. So fundamentally, this group do not like change. So large companies, it's not about culture, it's more about mindset where this middle group of people don't want to make the changes that you believe are really, really important. And that was really important for me because I was looking at the UK business. I never became CEO in the UK, and I questioned sometimes whether I would have been effective. Because when I went to India, Ghana, and Qatar, I suddenly had the opportunity to create a different business model that would take my responsiveness and deal with the concrete layer. So the thing I learned in India was that Indian management is where you have a very small number of people at a senior level who decide everything and then they want everyone else to execute. So no debate, no collaboration, nothing. Here are the thing I need you to do, get on and do it. And that works really well in India. India is that type of environment. When I go to Ghana, it wasn't like that. It was actually 40 people who got the other 1,500 people to do stuff. So motivating and engaging that 40 to get the other 1,500 to work was the tactic I used. And in Qatar, it was completely different again, because again, you had 1,000 people, but with that 1,000 people came from completely different cultures. So you could be sat in an audience with Qatari ladies, Qatari men, someone from New Zealand. There was 45 nationalities. So what I learned there was one common purpose that bonds a company together that the CEO has to be able to drive and engage on, which is what is our purpose and how are we going to get to delivering that purpose? Because it didn't matter if you were a Qatari lady or an Australian guy in marketing, we all could have a common purpose that we all wanted to do. So in Ghana, it was about making people's lives better every day through health and education, right? It was just about helping show that we could deliver a higher purpose than the competition. And in Qatar, it was about making Qatari people proud of Vodafone because they had only ever known one company, which was QTEL became Ooredoo, government owned. And I wanted to build pride that we were different. So we created a pride purpose about you love working here. I love working here. Let's get going now. So what I did was when I joined Avanti, I decided I would try and combine everything together into one system. And the system was that because predominantly a lot of our customers are American but are delivering service in Africa, I had experience of living and working in Africa, which again, American companies are not hugely present in Africa. I wanted to combine them all together to say, right, I know that when I go meet an African government and I'm trying to sell a contract to them, they're thinking, yeah, but what's in it for the country? And in South Africa, I learned the hard way. I used to go into one customer and say, when are you going to sign a contract? When are you going to sign a contract? And they kept saying, hang on, Kyle, what are you doing to help the local economy? And I say, sign a contract. I'll definitely promise I'll do that. So when I joined Avanti, I said, we're going to make purpose first. So we created a project called Project Heart. And what Project Heart did was it started to show publicly that what we actually cared about was, and in this particular case, we used two programs. We used the Imalango project in Kenya, which is with the world's biggest digitally connected education program for marginalized girls under 10. So every day, our product, satellite and digital education, was being accessed by 300,000 schoolgirls in rural Kenya, and they could accelerate their learning by 3 times what they would have learned without this platform, and was really exciting to watch. And then the second one was one of the biggest problems that African countries have is the migration of refugees into across difficult borders. So we built connectivity into through UNICEF into seven biggest refugee camps in East Africa, because the first thing a refugee wants to do is try and connect with his or her old world. And so Project Heart was to show that Avanti's mission was to make lives people better, whoever you were, 8-year-old girl, 45-year-old refugee, whoever, we wanted to make your life better. So that was the kind of first platform we wanted. And what we wanted people to do was to buy into that concept about how we behaved on a day-to-day basis. So my team were all advocates of this program, and then we had to create an advocacy program that involved all of our staff into believing in this project, that would help us to be successful. And so we created a huge amount of interaction on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis about that, not about how much we'd sold, but how these programs were developing and engaging in these countries. I would send unusual people to go and see Imalango in Kenya, maybe like the HR director, because when the HR director came back, she said, oh my God, I cannot believe what I've seen. And suddenly the people leader in the business is an advocate of the program. So we just wanted every single day for people to believe passionately that we were doing good, and that would engage them into this higher purpose, which people talk about all the time. But we delivered that. And then we created my learning from Ghana, which was actually we can get 40 people really engaged on what we're trying to do from a business point of view. So we created that 40-person community. And my lesson from India was not so much about a small number of people making all the decisions, but about what I learned about being careful what your decisions are. So here's a terribly unbelievable anecdote. But on one Friday afternoon, so my head office in Vodafone India was in Mumbai, which is an amazingly crazy city. And we had an executive floor because it's very hierarchical in India, very hierarchical. So we would sit on this executive floor, and we had a toilet block that was entirely designed for men because there weren't that many women. So women would have to, like my secretaries, assistants, whatever, would have to walk downstairs and go to the ladies' toilets on the bottom floor. So I said to my secretary on the Friday, I said, this really annoys me. I said, we got far too much accommodation for men and not enough accommodation for women. Be lovely to do something about it. Now, as you know, any country in the world, the secretary's going, yeah, I'll make a note of that. I came back on Monday and it had been reconfigured. over the weekend. And it's like, wow. But there was no thought. There was no design concept. There was no logical thinking about it. It was just somebody told somebody in property, Kyle's not happy with the toilets. We need some girls' toilets in there. And suddenly it happened, but it didn't represent the right answer. So what I learned was be careful when you're being very directive into an organization about make sure that your message is the right message and it's well thought through and it's appropriate for the environment. So I think what I've really enjoyed in Avanti was that I had this opportunity to pull together all of the strands of my learning. Number one, responsive to customers, customers at heart of the company. Number two, especially the new generations want to come and work for a company with a strong purpose, but it must be authentic. It must be absolutely authentic what you're talking about. And I had 2 authentic projects. Number 3 was when I'm directing the organization, I need to make sure that the 40 people are buying into what we're talking about, because I don't want to create an India type of environment where I say, hey, look, this is what we're going to do, and people just go off and do it without thinking about it. So engaging and getting people to buy into the concepts. So I think I created a company. I would never have been able to do it in a big company. I know from one of my very, very good friends who sits on the board of large international companies, every single board, I'm talking world-class, large companies, that every board meeting they say, we need to be more entrepreneurial. And they even have people come and present, we need to be more entrepreneurial. And I say to her, Susan, I don't believe you. She said, oh no, we've never done anything about it. But every month we feel better about the fact we've created this platform called We Need to Be More Entrepreneurial. But it's never going to happen because big companies can't do it. That's the sad part, isn't it? They just aren't physically capable of doing it.
"21st Century Entrepreneurship" with Martin Piskarik.
Imagine a space where triumphs, trials, and tales of entrepreneurship come alive. Welcome to the 21st Century Entrepreneurship Podcast, a gold awarded journey hosted by Martin Piskarik, connecting with listeners in 95 countries and ranking in the top 0.5% of all podcasts. Join our exclusive community, elevate your perspective, and embark on the path to success.